The calm before the storm. Elijah Monroe strode confidently through the bustling airport terminal. A gifted black inventor in his early 30s, Elijah had just delivered a groundbreaking presentation at a global summit. His invention, a neural communication device capable of connecting people's thoughts directly across distances, had earned him a standing ovation and inquiries from top tech firms. Today, however, his focus wasn't on the accolades or the whirlwind of business cards exchanged. It was on the quiet reprieve of a first-class seat on a flight back home. The terminal echoed with the typical sounds of travel: hurried footsteps, the clatter of luggage wheels, and muffled boarding announcements. Elijah moved with ease, his sleek laptop bag slung over his shoulder. It contained not only his invention's blueprints, but also a symbol of his resilience, a reminder of the years spent battling skepticism and bias to achieve recognition. As he approached the gate, Elijah presented his ticket to the agent, who scanned it with a polite nod. He thanked her and stepped onto the jet bridge, his mind already wandering to the comfort awaiting him. First class was a luxury Elijah indulged in sparingly, but after weeks of sleepless nights fine-tuning his presentation, he considered this small respite well-earned. Elijah settled into his seat, appreciating the spacious leather and the serene atmosphere of first class. Most passengers were already immersed in their pre-flight routines, scrolling on their phones, sipping champagne, or flipping through magazines. He retrieved his notes from his laptop bag, planning to review the feedback from the summit while savoring the quiet. But tranquility was short-lived. A flight attendant appeared in the aisle, making her way through the cabin with an air of practiced efficiency. Blonde hair neatly tucked into a bun and uniform impeccably pressed. Her name tag read Claire. Elijah didn't think much of her at first. She was simply another face in the stream of airline staff he had encountered countless times. It wasn't until Claire's gaze lingered on him, longer than felt appropriate, that Elijah sensed something was amiss. Her eyes flickered to his laptop bag, her expression betraying an unspoken question. Elijah was no stranger to these looks. They carried the weight of doubt, a silent inquiry as to whether he truly belonged in spaces like this. Minutes later, Claire returned, clipboard in hand. She stopped beside Elijah's seat, her smile polite, but her tone laced with authority. "Excuse me, sir," she began. "I just wanted to confirm your seat assignment. May I see your ticket, please?" Elijah's eyes narrowed slightly, but his expression remained calm. He handed over his ticket without a word. Claire scrutinized it for a moment longer than necessary before returning it with an almost imperceptible nod. "Thank you," she said, her smile tight. Elijah watched her retreat down the aisle, a faint tension settling in his chest. This wasn't new. It was the subtle questioning, the veiled skepticism he had encountered in boardrooms and upscale establishments alike. A quiet but persistent challenge to prove he deserved to be where he was. Across the aisle, an older woman with silver hair and a warm demeanor observed the exchange. She offered Elijah a small nod, a silent gesture of solidarity. Elijah nodded back, appreciating the acknowledgement but wishing it hadn't been necessary. He tried to refocus on his notes, but his concentration was broken by a faint murmur behind him. "Doesn't seem like he belongs here, does he?" a man whispered to his companion, his tone low but not low enough. Elijah froze, his hands tightening around his papers. He had learned long ago to ignore these moments, to let them pass like unwelcome gusts of wind. But today, the words lingered, each syllable settling uncomfortably in his mind. As the plane continued to board, Claire returned, this time standing beside Elijah's seat with an air of resolution. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying a practiced politeness, "I need to check your bag. It's just a routine security measure." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "My bag?" he asked, his tone measured. "It's already been through TSA screening." "I understand," Claire replied, her smile unwavering. "But this is an additional check for first-class passengers." Elijah's gaze swept the cabin. None of the other first-class passengers were being subjected to such scrutiny. He unclipped his bag and handed it over, his movements deliberate and calm. Claire opened the bag, her hands moving quickly through its contents. Notebooks, cables, and the sleek, compact prototype of his device. She lingered a moment on the blueprint, her fingers tracing its edges before zipping the bag shut and returning it. "Thank you for your cooperation," she said, moving on as though nothing had happened. Elijah exhaled slowly, his grip tightening on the armrest. Across the aisle, the silver-haired woman's magazine lowered, her gaze filled with quiet indignation. "That was unnecessary," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for Elijah to hear. He offered her a faint smile, but inside, a storm was brewing. This wasn't about a bag or a ticket. It was about something deeper, an unspoken belief that he needed to justify his presence, his success, and his humanity. The plane taxied onto the runway, but Elijah's thoughts raced faster than the engines. He had spent his life building bridges, technological and metaphorical, yet moments like these reminded him of the walls still standing in his path. As the wheels left the ground, Elijah resolved that this story wouldn't end here. The ripple effect. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, blending with the subtle rustle of passengers settling into the long-haul flight. Elijah Monroe sat in his first-class seat, outwardly calm but inwardly grappling with the events that had unfolded just before takeoff. Claire's unwarranted scrutiny of his ticket and bag gnawed at him, not because it was a new experience, but because it was an all-too-familiar one. He had learned to endure such moments with quiet dignity, but today he felt the weight of exhaustion, a tiredness that came not from the body but the soul. Across the aisle, the silver-haired woman, the unlikely ally who had acknowledged the unfairness earlier, gave him another knowing glance. This time, her expression was sharper, more resolute. Elijah appreciated her silent support, but he was wary. He had been in similar situations where allies, however well-intentioned, sometimes made things worse. "Excuse me," the woman finally said, her voice calm but firm as she leaned toward a passing flight attendant. It wasn't Claire, but a younger attendant with short-cropped hair and a nervous demeanor. The attendant paused. "Yes, Mom. How can I assist you?" The woman gestured subtly toward Elijah's seat. "I noticed some irregularities during boarding. Is it standard procedure to single out passengers like this gentleman for additional checks after TSA has already cleared them?" The attendant blinked, her cheeks flushing slightly. I'm not sure, ma'am. I'd have to ask." "Please do," the woman interrupted, her tone polite but insistent. "Because I've flown this airline for years, and I've never seen such procedures applied consistently across all passengers." Elijah's chest tightened as the air around them grew tense. The flight attendant nodded quickly, murmuring something about checking with her supervisor before retreating to the galley. Elijah turned to the woman, his voice low and steady. "You didn't have to do that." The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. "Yes, I did. And if more people spoke up, maybe these things wouldn't happen so often." Her words hung in the air, heavy with conviction. Elijah wanted to believe her, but years of navigating a world laden with bias had taught him caution. Change was rarely born from a single confrontation. It required sustained effort, often met with resistance. Minutes passed, and the tension in the cabin ebbed slightly as the flight attendants resumed their routine. Elijah tried to focus on his laptop, pulling up notes from the summit. He wanted to lose himself in work, to anchor his mind to something productive. But his thoughts kept returning to Claire's actions, the murmured comments from passengers, and the way moments like these compounded over time. Then, as if summoned by his thoughts, Claire reappeared. Her posture was stiff, her steps deliberate as she approached Elijah's row. She stopped just short of his seat, her smile strained. "Sir," she began, her voice laced with forced politeness, "I wanted to ensure everything is satisfactory. Is there anything you need?" Elijah glanced up from his screen, his expression unreadable. He knew this wasn't a genuine gesture of service, but an attempt to reassert control over a situation that had begun to slip from her grasp. "No, thank you," he replied evenly, his tone betraying nothing. Claire hesitated, as if waiting for him to say more. When he didn't, she nodded curtly and moved on. Across the aisle, the silver-haired woman watched her go, a small, knowing smirk tugging at the corners of her lips. But the moment wasn't over. A low voice from a few rows behind cut through the quiet. "Funny how she's only checking on him," the man said, his tone loud enough to carry, but not so loud as to cause a scene. Heads turned, and murmurs rippled through the cabin. Elijah didn't look back, but he could feel the weight of the passengers' gazes shifting toward Claire, who had frozen mid-step. Her shoulders tensed, and she turned sharply to face the source of the comment. "I'm sorry, sir. Was there something you needed?" she asked, her voice tight. The man, an older passenger with a baseball cap and a salt and pepper beard, leaned back in his seat and shrugged. "Just an observation. Seems like some passengers get a lot more attention than others." The tension in the cabin thickened, the unspoken accusation hanging in the air. Claire's smile faltered, and for a moment she looked like she might respond. But then she turned on her heel and retreated to the galley without another word. Elijah exhaled quietly, his grip on the armrest loosening slightly. He didn't want a scene, didn't want the flight to devolve into conflict, but he couldn't deny the small spark of validation he felt knowing that others had noticed the unfairness. The silver-haired woman leaned closer again, her voice low. "You handled that well." Elijah gave her a faint smile. "Did I have a choice?" She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "No, but you did it with more grace than most." The flight continued, but the atmosphere in the first-class cabin remained charged. Passengers cast furtive glances toward the galley, where Claire and another flight attendant, a senior man named Lewis, appeared to be in quiet but animated conversation. Elijah caught fragments of their exchange when the galley door opened briefly. Words like protocol, misunderstanding, and overreacting drifted through the cabin. Lewis eventually emerged, his expression carefully neutral as he approached Elijah's seat. "Mr. Monroe," he began, his tone smooth but rehearsed. "I understand there was some confusion earlier. I wanted to personally apologize and assure you that your experience with us matters." Elijah looked up, his gaze steady. "Thank you," he said simply, though his tone carried a hint of skepticism. Lewis shifted uncomfortably, sensing the unspoken question behind Elijah's words. He glanced toward Claire, who lingered near the galley, her posture rigid. "We want to make sure all our passengers feel welcome and respected," Lewis continued. "If there's anything we can do to improve your experience, please don't hesitate to let us know." Elijah nodded once, signaling the end of the conversation. As Lewis walked away, the silver-haired woman spoke again, her voice tinged with quiet defiance. "Maybe next time they'll think twice." Elijah's smile returned, faint but genuine this time. "Maybe," he replied. But deep down, he wasn't convinced. Change, he knew, required more than polite apologies and fleeting moments of solidarity. It demanded a shift in the very fabric of how people saw one another, a change that couldn't be forced in the confines of a single flight. As the plane cruised at 35,000 feet, Elijah resolved to focus on what he could control: his work, his success, and his unwavering commitment to breaking barriers. The world wasn't going to change overnight, but he would keep pushing, one step at a time. The clouds outside the window remained steady and unyielding, a quiet reminder that even in turbulence, one could find a path forward. A conversation begins. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight attendants began preparing for the evening service. Elijah Monroe sat quietly in his first-class seat, his laptop open but his mind elsewhere. The tension from earlier still lingered, an invisible thread tying him to the events that had unfolded. He felt the weight of the murmurs and stolen glances, but chose not to react. Experience had taught him that patience often disarmed prejudice more effectively than confrontation. Yet there were moments when patience was no longer enough. A voice interrupted his thoughts, Mind if I join you for a bit? Elijah turned to find the silver-haired woman from across the aisle standing beside his seat, holding a glass of red wine. Her expression was warm but tinged with curiosity. "Not at all," he replied, gesturing to the empty seat next to him. She settled in gracefully, placing her glass on the tray table. "I'm Meredith," she said, offering her hand. "Elijah," he replied, shaking it. Meredith studied him for a moment, her eyes soft but probing. "You handled all of that back there with remarkable composure. I don't think I would have managed as well in your shoes." Elijah leaned back in his seat, a faint smile playing on his lips. "It's not the first time, and it probably won't be the last. You get used to it." Meredith's brow furrowed, and she sipped her wine thoughtfully. That's a tragedy in itself, that anyone has to get used to it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of the engines filled the silence, a steady backdrop to their conversation. Finally, Meredith broke the quiet. "If you don't mind me asking," she began cautiously, "what is it you do? I saw you working earlier. Something tells me you're not just jotting down grocery lists." Elijah chuckled softly, appreciating her attempt to lighten the mood. "I'm an inventor," he said. "I develop communication technologies. My latest project is a neural interface that could revolutionize how people connect. Think instant thought sharing across any distance." Meredith's eyes widened. "That's extraordinary. And you've already presented this to investors?" He nodded. "I was at a global summit before this flight. It went well. Better than I expected, honestly. But moments like today remind me that no matter how far I go, there are still hurdles to overcome." Meredith tilted her head, her expression pensive. "You'd think that being brilliant, successful, and, let's be honest, probably a lot smarter than most of us would be enough to silence doubters. But prejudice doesn't play fair, does it?" "It doesn't," Elijah agreed. "But I've learned not to let it define me. Every obstacle is just another opportunity to prove people wrong. Not that I should have to." Meredith nodded slowly, swirling her wine in its glass. "You're right. You shouldn't have to. But I respect the way you handle it." Their conversation was interrupted as the flight attendants rolled out the dinner service. Claire was among them, her demeanor subdued but professional. When she reached their row, her eyes briefly met Elijah's, and for the first time, he saw something resembling discomfort in her expression. "Would you care for dinner?" she asked, her voice softer than before. Elijah nodded. "Yes, please. The chicken, if you have it." Claire served him without comment and moved on quickly. Meredith raised an eyebrow, watching the interaction. "She seems different now," Meredith observed, her voice low. Elijah shrugged. "Maybe she's realized how obvious her behavior was earlier, or maybe she's just trying to avoid another scene." "Still, you handled her well," Meredith said. "Grace under fire, as they say." Elijah didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a moment to savor the first bite of his meal, the flavors grounding him in the present. After a few moments, he spoke again. "Grace is a necessity when you're navigating a world that wasn't built for you," he said, "but sometimes I wonder if it's enough. Patience and composure don't always lead to change." Meredith leaned forward, her elbows resting on the armrests. "So what does?" Elijah met her gaze, his eyes steady. "People noticing. Speaking up. Doing what you did earlier. Calling out the unfairness when they see it." Meredith's lips curved into a small smile. "Well, I suppose I'll have to keep doing that, then." Their conversation continued as the flight progressed, touching on topics ranging from Elijah's work to Meredith's travels. She was a retired professor, she explained, with a passion for exploring different cultures. Elijah found her insights refreshing, her perspective grounded in empathy and curiosity. As they spoke, Elijah felt the tension in his chest ease slightly. It wasn't often that he encountered someone willing to engage in meaningful dialogue about these issues without defensiveness or dismissiveness. Meredith's presence was a reminder that allies existed, even in the unlikeliest of places. But their quiet moment of connection was interrupted once more. The galley curtain parted, and Lewis, the senior flight attendant, emerged. His expression was neutral, but his eyes carried a hint of wariness. He approached Elijah's seat with measured steps, pausing a few feet away. "Mr. Monroe," he began, his tone carefully controlled. "I wanted to follow up and make sure everything is satisfactory. If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to let us know." Elijah studied him for a moment before responding. "Thank you, but I'm fine." Lewis hesitated, glancing briefly at Meredith before continuing. "We appreciate your understanding earlier. Sometimes misunderstandings happen, and we strive to ensure all our passengers have a positive experience." Meredith scoffed softly, but said nothing. Elijah chose his words carefully. "I understand that mistakes happen," he said evenly, "but it's how those mistakes are handled that makes the difference." Lewis nodded, his posture stiff. "Of course, sir. If there's anything we can do." Elijah's gaze didn't waver. "You can start by reflecting on why certain passengers are treated differently in the first place." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. Lewis offered a tight nod and retreated to the galley, leaving Elijah and Meredith to their conversation. "That was well said," Meredith remarked, her tone filled with admiration. "Sometimes you have to plant seeds and hope they grow," Elijah replied. Meredith smiled. "And sometimes you need to be the one who waters them." The plane flew on, the hum of the engine steady and unyielding. Elijah felt a renewed sense of purpose, not because the tension had disappeared, but because he knew he wasn't alone in confronting it. For the first time that evening, he allowed himself to relax, his thoughts turning to the work ahead and the allies he might find along the way. The unexpected ally. The cabin had settled into a quiet rhythm, passengers flipping through magazines, dozing off, or watching in-flight entertainment. Elijah Monroe was keenly aware of the ebb and flow of energy around him, as though the earlier tension had been swallowed by the hum of the engines. He leaned back in his seat, his laptop closed now, his thoughts unfocused. Meredith, his silver-haired companion, had returned to her seat across the aisle, but not before giving him a small, reassuring nod. Her quiet support had been a balm, but Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that the situation wasn't yet over. Moments like these rarely ended cleanly. They lingered, waiting for an inevitable ripple. He didn't have to wait long. Claire emerged from the galley again, her movements sharp and deliberate. She didn't look at Elijah directly but seemed to hover near his row, rearranging items on the service cart and speaking in hushed tones with Lewis, the senior flight attendant. Their exchange was brief, but it left Claire visibly unsettled. She straightened her uniform and walked purposefully toward Elijah's seat. "Mr. Monroe," she began, her voice strained but attempting politeness. Elijah raised an eyebrow, signaling his attention but offering no verbal response. "I wanted to apologize again for earlier," she said, her words coming quickly, almost rehearsed. "There was no intention to make you uncomfortable." Elijah held her gaze for a moment, weighing his response. He had seen this before, the carefully measured apology designed to mitigate damage without truly addressing the underlying issue. "I appreciate the sentiment," he replied evenly, "but intention doesn't erase impact." Claire's expression faltered, the practiced mask slipping for a fraction of a second. She shifted her weight uncomfortably, as though standing too long in one place had become unbearable. "I understand," she said, her voice softer now. "We'll make sure there are no further inconveniences." With that, she turned and hurried back toward the galley, leaving Elijah to his thoughts once more. But something about her retreat felt less like resolution and more like retreating to regroup. The quiet didn't last. A new voice, deep and resonant, cut through the cabin's muted hum. "Excuse me, is everything all right here?" Elijah turned his head to see the man with the baseball cap, his earlier defender, standing in the aisle, his stance firm and commanding. His salt and pepper beard framed a face lined with experience, and his eyes held an intensity that seemed to demand answers. "I couldn't help but notice," the man continued, his tone polite but insistent, "that certain passengers seem to be getting more attention than others. Care to explain why that might be?" Lewis appeared almost instantly, his composure intact, but his eyes betraying a flicker of unease. "Sir, we assure you that all passengers are treated with the utmost respect," Lewis said, his voice smooth and diplomatic. The man crossed his arms, unimpressed. "Respect, huh? Funny how it doesn't always look that way from this side of the aisle." Passengers began to stir, their curiosity piqued by the confrontation. Some pretended to remain engrossed in their own activities, but their sidelong glances told another story. Elijah stayed silent, his focus on the unfolding scene. He didn't know this man, didn't even catch his name, but he recognized the strength in his actions. Allies came in many forms, and sometimes the most effective ones were the voices loud enough to break the silence. "You seem very concerned about ensuring a positive experience," the man pressed, his tone sharper now. "But I think you and your team need to take a hard look at what that means in practice." Lewis shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the galley as though seeking backup. Claire didn't emerge. Instead, Meredith chimed in from her seat. "He's right," she said, her voice carrying a surprising authority. "This isn't about service, it's about fairness. And what happened earlier wasn't fair." A murmur rippled through the cabin, passengers exchanging looks. The tension was no longer confined to Elijah's row. It had spread, touching everyone who had borne witness to the earlier events. Lewis held up his hands, his tone placating. "We hear your concerns, and I'll personally ensure that feedback is relayed to the appropriate channels." The man with the baseball cap raised an eyebrow. "Appropriate channels. That's a fancy way of saying you're going to bury it and hope we all forget." More murmurs, louder this time. Lewis's calm demeanor began to fray at the edges. "That's not our intention," he said quickly. "We take all feedback seriously." Meredith shook her head, her expression incredulous. "Feedback. This isn't about feedback. It's about accountability. And until that's taken seriously, nothing will change." Elijah watched the exchange with quiet resolve. He could feel the tide turning, the cabin shifting from passive observation to active engagement. It wasn't the dramatic confrontation he had feared, but a collective awakening, a realization that what had transpired wasn't just an isolated incident. He cleared his throat, drawing attention back to himself. "I appreciate the support," he began, his voice steady. "But let me make something clear. This isn't about me alone. This is about a system that allows bias to operate unchecked. It's about creating a culture where everyone is treated with dignity, regardless of who they are or where they're seated." The cabin fell silent, his words sinking in. Lewis nodded slowly, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Monroe," he said, "and I'll make sure this is addressed. Personally." Elijah met his gaze, searching for sincerity. "I hope you do, because the next time this happens, it might not be someone as willing to keep their composure." Lewis hesitated, then extended a hand. Elijah shook it briefly, signaling the end of the exchange. As Lewis retreated to the galley, the man with the baseball cap returned to his seat, offering Elijah a small nod. Meredith leaned across the aisle again, her eyes filled with quiet admiration. "That was powerful," she said softly. Elijah shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Sometimes you just have to remind people what's at stake." Meredith nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "And sometimes you remind them they're not alone." The cabin settled once more, but the atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. The unspoken solidarity among the passengers lingered, a quiet testament to the power of collective action. For the first time in hours, Elijah felt the tension in his chest begin to ease. Change wasn't immediate, but today, a seed had been planted. And as the plane continued its journey through the night, he allowed himself to hope that it would one day bear fruit. Breaking the silence, The hum of the engines was a constant backdrop to the first-class cabin, where the tension had morphed into something more palpable, an air of expectancy. Elijah Monroe remained seated, his composure unshaken but his mind racing. The series of confrontations that had unfolded since takeoff was far from ordinary. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about a system that many on board were seeing clearly for the first time. Claire, the flight attendant whose actions had sparked the turmoil, had retreated entirely from the cabin. Her absence was as loud as her earlier presence, her every move scrutinized and questioned by passengers who once might have overlooked it. Meanwhile, Lewis, the senior flight attendant, had adopted a role of damage control, moving between rows and offering reassurances that seemed to lack conviction. But it wasn't over, not yet. The man with the baseball cap, now comfortably slouched in his seat, glanced over at Elijah with a slight grin. "You know," he said loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "I've been flying for decades. Seen all kinds of nonsense on these planes. But this one's going in my book." Elijah raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. "Your book?" "Figure of speech," the man replied with a chuckle. "But if I ever did write one, today's chapter would be called Don't Mess with the Guy in First Class." A few passengers chuckled softly, their tension easing momentarily. The man's humor was a welcome distraction, but Elijah wasn't ready to let the moment pass without reflection. "You speak up often?" Elijah asked, his tone light but curious. The man shrugged. "Not as often as I should, but when you see something like this, you don't just sit there and pretend it's fine. That's how it keeps happening." Elijah nodded, appreciating the honesty. "Most people prefer to look away. Most people don't want to rock the boat," the man said, leaning forward slightly. "But sometimes the boat needs a good shake." Across the aisle, Meredith was deep in thought, her magazine forgotten in her lap. Finally, she spoke, her voice carrying a quiet intensity. "It's interesting, isn't it?" she mused. "How quickly the mood in a room changes when one person decides not to stay silent." Elijah turned to her, sensing there was more to her statement. "When I was a professor," Meredith continued, "I used to tell my students that silence is the loudest response to injustice. It speaks volumes, but not in the way people think. It says, this is acceptable, and that's dangerous." Elijah leaned back, considering her words. "Do you think today was enough to break the silence?" Meredith tilted her head thoughtfully. "It's a start, but breaking silence is one thing. Building momentum is another." The curtain to the galley shifted, drawing everyone's attention. Claire reappeared, her posture stiff, her expression carefully neutral. She approached Elijah's row with deliberate steps, stopping just short of his seat. "Mr. Monroe," she began, her voice quieter than before, "I owe you an apology. A real one." Elijah met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I'm listening." Claire hesitated, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I made assumptions earlier that were unfair and unprofessional. There's no excuse for it. I can only promise to do better moving forward." The cabin was silent, every passenger now an unintentional witness to her admission. Elijah studied her carefully, searching for sincerity. He didn't detect the usual defensiveness or deflection that often accompanied such apologies. Still, he knew better than to accept words at face value. "I appreciate your apology," he said finally, his tone even. "But this isn't just about me. It's about ensuring that everyone is treated with the respect they deserve, whether they're in first class or coach." Claire nodded, her expression serious. "You're right, and I'll make sure this is addressed with our team." Elijah inclined his head slightly, signaling the end of their exchange. Claire retreated to the galley once more, her steps less hurried, but still heavy with the weight of accountability. As the cabin settled, a new voice broke the quiet, this time from a young woman seated a few rows ahead. She turned in her seat, addressing no one in particular, but speaking with conviction. "I think we all owe Mr. Monroe an apology," she said, for sitting here and watching this unfold without saying anything sooner. The ripple effect was immediate. A middle-aged man in a crisp suit nodded solemnly. "She's right. We all saw it, and most of us stayed quiet. That's on us." A woman with 2 children in tow added, "I didn't know what to say. But now I wish I'd spoken up." Elijah was struck by the wave of admissions. He wasn't used to this, seeing people take ownership of their inaction. It was a stark contrast to the usual indifference or awkward silence that often followed incidents like these. "You don't owe me an apology," Elijah said, his voice firm but kind. "But if today makes you more aware, more willing to speak up in the future, then that's enough." Meredith smiled softly, her gaze steady on Elijah. "You're a patient man." "I've had to be," Elijah replied. "But patience doesn't mean complacency." The plane began its descent, the captain's voice crackling over the intercom with updates about their arrival. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted once again, this time towards something more hopeful. The earlier tension had given way to reflection, an unspoken agreement among the passengers to carry the lessons of this flight beyond its final destination. As the wheels touched down, Elijah felt a sense of closure, not because the issue had been resolved, but because progress, however small, had been made. People had noticed, had spoken up, had chosen not to let the moment pass unnoticed. It was a start, and sometimes that was enough. As the plane taxied to the gate, Meredith leaned over one last time. "I have a feeling this flight is going to stick with a lot of us." Elijah smiled faintly. "Let's hope it leads to something better." And as the passengers began to disembark, Elijah carried with him a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that change, however slow, was always worth pursuing. A new kind of landing. As the plane taxied to its final stop, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin felt different, lighter, yet heavy with unspoken questions. People moved carefully, as if afraid to disturb the fragile shift that had taken place. Elijah Monroe watched the flurry of activity around him, his laptop bag now secure beneath his seat, untouched since Claire's apology. His thoughts were no longer on the confrontation itself, but on the quiet ripple it had caused among the passengers. Meredith, across the aisle, was gathering her things with the same composed elegance she had maintained throughout the flight. She caught Elijah's eye and offered a small, knowing smile. "Will you let me buy you a coffee at the terminal?" she asked. "I'd like to hear more about your work, if you're willing." Elijah chuckled softly. "I might take you up on that, but you're not off the hook. I want to hear more about what makes a retired professor speak up like you did." Meredith's smile deepened, and she patted the book resting on top of her carry-on. A life spent teaching others that silence is complicity has a way of sticking with you. The flight attendants began opening overhead compartments, offering polite instructions as passengers prepared to disembark. Claire moved through the rows, her demeanor subdued but professional. She paused briefly near Elijah's seat, as though debating whether to speak again, but ultimately continued down the aisle without a word. Elijah caught a glimpse of Lewis at the front of the cabin, speaking with the flight crew. Their exchange appeared serious, and Lewis' expression was thoughtful, if not slightly chastened. Elijah hoped the events of the flight would lead to more than just whispered promises of improvement. Change required not just acknowledgement but action. As the line of passengers shuffled forward, Elijah felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see the man with the baseball cap standing beside him, his face creased with an easygoing grin. "Hey," the man said, his voice low but steady. "You handled yourself like a pro back there. Not sure I'd have had the same patience." Elijah extended a hand, which the man shook firmly. "Thanks. But patience only goes so far. People like you, Meredith, speaking up, that's what makes the difference." The man nodded, his grin softening into something more reflective. "Well, I'll keep that in mind the next time something like this happens, and I've got a feeling there'll be a next time." Elijah smiled faintly. "There's always a next time. It's what we do in those moments that counts." The man gave a short, respectful nod before turning to follow the flow of passengers. When Elijah stepped off the plane and into the terminal, he felt a strange mix of relief and resolve. Airports had always been liminal spaces for him, a blur of motion and noise where the world's biases often collided with his quiet determination to exist as he was, without apology or justification. Today had been no different, yet it had ended with a sliver of hope. Meredith was waiting for him near a coffee shop, her carry-on neatly parked beside her. She waved him over, and they found a table near the window overlooking the runway. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the low hum of travelers passing by. "So," she began, cradling her cup, "tell me about this neural interface of yours. I'm curious." Elijah laughed softly, shaking his head. "I thought we were going to talk about you. You've been the unexpected star of this flight." Meredith shrugged, her eyes twinkling. "Fair enough. But you first." Elijah leaned back, his posture relaxed for the first time in hours. He launched into an explanation of his work, describing the possibilities of thought-to-thought communication and the ways it could bridge divides in ways that traditional technology couldn't. Meredith listened intently, occasionally asking pointed questions that revealed her sharp intellect. As they spoke, Elijah noticed something remarkable. Passengers from the flight walking by, some offering small nods or smiles. It was as if the events on board had left an imprint on everyone, even in this transient space. One of them, a young woman who had been seated near the back of first class, approached hesitantly. She looked at Elijah, her cheeks pink with nervousness. "Excuse me," she began, clutching the strap of her backpack. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for not speaking up earlier. I saw what happened, and I should have said something. I'll do better next time." Elijah's smile was warm but measured. "Thank you. It takes courage to admit that, and even more to act on it. That's what matters." The woman nodded, her expression one of quiet determination, before hurrying off. Meredith raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a small smile. "You're planting seeds, Elijah." He nodded thoughtfully, watching the woman disappear into the crowd. "Let's hope they grow." As the conversation with Meredith wound down, Elijah felt a renewed sense of purpose. The flight hadn't been just another exhausting confrontation. It had been a moment of clarity, for himself and for others. While he couldn't single-handedly dismantle the biases that had followed him throughout his life, he could continue to live in a way that challenged them, inching the world toward something better. Meredith reached across the table and placed a hand on his. "Keep doing what you're doing," she said softly. "The world needs people like you, more than ever." Elijah met her gaze, his resolve clear. "And people like you. Allies willing to stand up when it matters." They parted ways shortly after, Meredith heading for her connecting flight and Elijah heading for the rideshare pickup area. As he stepped into the crisp evening air, he felt a lightness he hadn't expected. Today, he had been reminded that change was slow and often painful, but it was possible, and worth fighting for. The horizon ahead seemed just a little brighter. The impact beyond the flight. Elijah Monroe exited the airport into the cool evening air, his mind still turning over the events of the day. The crisp breeze carried with it the faint scent of rain, a welcome contrast to the tense, recycled air of the airplane cabin. He slung his laptop bag over his shoulder and walked toward the rideshare pickup area, his steps measured, his thoughts heavy but focused. It wasn't the first time he had faced bias in such a public, undeniable way, but this time felt different. It wasn't the confrontation itself. He had grown accustomed to the quiet burden of proving his worth in spaces where he was doubted. What lingered in his mind was the response. People had noticed. They had spoken up. And for once, the burden of calling out injustice hadn't been his alone. As he climbed into the back seat of the waiting car, his phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket and saw a notification from a social media platform. Curious, he opened it and was greeted by a flood of messages, tags, and comments. Someone had recorded parts of the flight's confrontation. the murmurs, the questions, the final exchange with Claire, and posted it online. The video had already garnered thousands of views, and the comments were multiplying by the minute. Elijah's initial reaction was frustration. He hadn't wanted this moment to become a spectacle, hadn't sought the attention that came with being thrust into the spotlight. But as he scrolled through the comments, his perspective began to shift. "I can't believe this still happens. Kudos to the guy for staying calm. Don't think I could have done the same. This isn't just about one flight. It's about a system that lets people get away with this. Glad people on the plane spoke up. I hope this airline takes accountability. Props to the passengers who didn't stay silent." Elijah closed the app, leaning back against the headrest. He felt the familiar weight of responsibility pressing down on him. The video had taken on a life of its own, and now, whether he liked it or not, he was part of the larger conversation. The driver, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Rough flight?" he asked, his voice light but curious. Elijah hesitated before responding. "You could say that. Some people decided it was time to challenge the status quo." The driver nodded thoughtfully. "About time, if you ask me. World's not gonna change if everyone stays quiet." Elijah smiled faintly, appreciating the sentiment. "You're not wrong." By the time Elijah arrived home, he had resolved to take control of the narrative. He didn't want the video to be reduced to another fleeting moment of internet outrage. If people were going to talk about what had happened, he wanted to steer the conversation towards something constructive. He set his laptop on the kitchen counter and opened his email, already bracing himself for the inevitable flood of inquiries. Sure enough, there were messages from reporters, advocacy groups, and even representatives from the airline. Most were polite and diplomatic, offering apologies or requesting interviews, but a few stood out as genuine attempts to engage with the broader issues. Elijah ignored them for the moment, instead opening a blank document and beginning to type. Subject: a better way forward. Message: today, I experienced something many people face far too often. Being judged before being understood, questioned before being believed. It's not new, and it's not unique to me. But what made today different was the response. People spoke up. They noticed. They refused to stay silent. That's how change begins, not with one person demanding justice, but with many choosing to stand together and say, "This isn't right." I'm sharing this not to point fingers or assign blame, but to spark a conversation. How can we do better? How can we create spaces where everyone feels they belong? To those who stood with me today, thank you. To those watching and wondering how to help, start by noticing. Speak up when you see something wrong. Don't wait for someone else to lead. Be the voice that makes a difference. Let's move forward, together. Satisfied, Elijah saved the draft and scheduled it for the following morning. He wasn't naive enough to think a single message could change the world, but he believed in planting seeds. If even a handful of people were inspired to act differently, it would be worth it. The next day, the response to his post was overwhelming. Messages poured in from people sharing their own stories, expressing support, and pledging to be more aware in their daily lives. Organizations reached out, offering to collaborate on initiatives promoting equity and accountability in public spaces. Even the airline, now fully aware of the public attention, issued a statement acknowledging the incident and committing to mandatory bias training for their staff. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. Weeks later, Elijah found himself at another airport, heading to another conference. As he waited in the lounge, a young woman approached him, her face alight with recognition. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly. "Are you Elijah Monroe, the inventor?" Elijah smiled. "I am. I saw the video from your flight," she continued, "and your message afterward. It really made me think about how I react when I see unfairness. I just wanted to say thank you." Elijah's chest tightened, a mix of gratitude and responsibility washing over him. "Thank you for saying that. It means a lot." The woman nodded, her expression earnest. "Keep doing what you're doing. The world needs it. As she walked away, Elijah returned to his seat, his resolve stronger than ever. The path ahead wasn't easy, but moments like these reminded him why it was worth walking. The world wasn't going to change overnight, but it could change. One step, one voice, one choice at a time.